In the summer of 2020, in a small village on the island of Okinawa, a construction crew broke ground on what was supposed to be a simple foundation for a new community center. The bulldozer's blade bit into the earth, turning over soil that hadn't been disturbed in 3/4 of a century. And then the machine stopped. The operator had seen something. A glint of metal. A shape that didn't belong. What they found, wrapped in decaying canvas and sealed inside a rusted ammunition canister, was a letter. Not just any letter. The final words of a man who knew he was about to die. A soldier who had no illusions about tomorrow. His name was written at the bottom in careful, shaking characters. Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto, 23 years old, and he had been waiting 75 years for someone to hear him. This is his story, and it is also ours. To understand the weight of those words, written in the desperate hours before death, we must first understand the world that created them. The spring and summer of 1945, the final terrible chapter of a war that had already consumed millions. By April of that year, Japan was dying. Not the quick death of a bullet, but the slow, suffocating death of a nation that had bet everything and lost. American bombers darkened the skies over Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya. Entire city blocks vanished in walls of flame. The firebombing of Tokyo alone killed more than 100,000 civilians in a single night. Mothers clutched their children in the burning streets. The elderly waited in their homes, too tired to run, accepting what was coming. The government told the people to fight to the last man, woman, and child. Surrender was not a word in the national vocabulary. It was a concept so shameful that it literally did not exist in the Imperial Army's field manual. Death before dishonor, victory or annihilation. These were not slogans, they were commands etched into the soul of every soldier from the moment he put on the uniform. But behind the propaganda, behind the promises of divine wind and final victory, the men in the foxholes knew the truth. They could feel it in the way their officers looked at them, in the shrinking rations, in the silence of the radio when they asked for reinforcements that would never come. They were being asked to die, not for victory, just to die. To make the enemy pay in blood for every inch of sacred soil. Okinawa was chosen as the place where Japan would make that stand. A chain of islands stretching between the home islands and the advancing Americans. If Okinawa fell, the enemy would be at the doorstep. The invasion of Japan itself would be next. So Okinawa had to hold. Not forever. Just long enough. Long enough for what? No one could quite say anymore. But the order was clear. Hold. Fight, die if you must, and you must. In March of 1945, 110,000 Japanese soldiers dug into the hills and caves of Okinawa. They were a mixture of regular, Imperial Army troops, naval personnel whose ships had been sunk, and local conscripts, some as young as 14. They had artillery and machine guns and grenades. But more than anything, they had orders. Orders that made no room for doubt or mercy, or the basic human instinct to survive. Among them was Takeshi Yamamoto. He was not a warrior by nature, not a man who dreamed of glory. In the photographs that survived him, the ones his family kept in a small box on the household altar, he looks gentle. A thin face, serious eyes, the kind of young man who might have become a teacher or a clerk in another lifetime. He came from a farming family in Hiroshima Prefecture. His father grew rice and vegetables in fields that his grandfather had worked, and his grandfather before him. The family was not wealthy, but they were not poor. They had enough. Takeshi was the eldest son. That meant everything in a traditional family. It meant he carried the ancestors on his shoulders. It meant he would inherit the land, the name, the responsibility. His younger brother, Kenji, was 12 when Takeshi was conscripted. His sister, Yuki, was 9. They watched him pack his few belongings in the fall of 1943, 2 years before the end. His mother pressed a small amulet into his hand, a charm from the local shrine, and told him to come home. His father said nothing, just bowed, as if his son were already a ghost. The training was brutal, designed to strip away everything soft, everything civilian, everything human. They learned to charge with bayonets fixed, screaming until their throats bled. They learned to sleep in the mud, to eat whatever could be found, to ignore pain and fear and the voice inside that said, "This is wrong," This is insane. This will end in nothing but death. The instructors beat them for the smallest mistakes. Humiliation was a teaching tool. Shame was a weapon sharper than any blade. But what they could not beat out of Takeshi, what remained buried deep beneath the uniform and the discipline, was memory. Memory of home, of his mother's hands kneading dough for rice cakes on New Year's morning, of his father teaching him to read the clouds and know when rain was coming, of his sister laughing as she chased fireflies in the summer dusk. Those memories were dangerous. They made a man want to live, and a soldier who wanted to live might hesitate, might retreat, might choose survival over duty. By the time Takeshi arrived on Okinawa in February of 1945, he had learned to bury those memories deep. But he had not learned to forget them. No man can forget the things he loves. Not completely. Not even when forgetting would be easier. The Battle of Okinawa began on April 1st, 1945. The Americans called it L-Day, Love Day, an invasion force of more than 500,000 men, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. They came in waves, endless waves, ships stretching to the horizon. Battleships lobbed shells the size of automobiles into the hills. Fighters and bombers strafed anything that moved. The noise alone was enough to drive men mad, a continuous mechanical roar that drowned out thought itself. The Japanese defenders did not meet them on the beaches. That would have been suicide. Instead, they waited in the interior, in the ridges and caves and tunnels they had spent months preparing. The plan was to let the Americans land, let them push inland, and then bleed them. Slowly, yard by yard, make them pay for every foot of rock and coral, turn the island into a meat grinder. And it worked. For a time, the Americans found themselves fighting not just an army, but the land itself. Every hill was a fortress, every cave a tomb. They would clear a position with flamethrowers and grenades, move forward, and then take fire from positions they thought they had already destroyed. The Japanese emerged from tunnels behind them, attacked at night, melted back into the earth. It was a nightmare that had no end, no front line, no rules. Takeshi's unit was assigned to defend a ridge in the southern part of the island, a finger of high ground overlooking a valley that the Americans needed to pass through. It was not a particularly important position, not strategically, but it had to be held because every position had to be held. That was the doctrine. Every hill was sacred, every cave was a shrine. You held until you could not hold any longer, and then you died where you stood. They dug in deep, carved firing positions into the limestone, stacked stones for cover, rationed the ammunition so carefully that men counted individual bullets. Water was scarce, food even more so, a handful of rice per day, weeds boiled into soup, rats when they could catch them. The human body can endure extraordinary deprivation when it has no choice. When surrender is not an option, starvation becomes just another enemy to fight. The days blurred together, explosions, gunfire, the screams of wounded men echoing in the caves. Some of the wounded begged to be killed rather than left to die slowly. Some of the officers granted that mercy, some did not. Takeshi tried not to listen, tried to keep his hands busy, cleaning his rifle, checking his ammunition, writing letters he knew would never be sent. Letters to his mother, to Kenji, to Yuki. He wrote them anyway. It gave him something to do besides think. At night, when the bombardment eased, he would lie on his back and look at the stars. The same stars he had seen from his father's fields. The sky, at least, had not changed. The sky did not care about empires or invasions or the screaming of dying boys. It was infinite and cold and indifferent, and there was a strange comfort in that. Something larger than the war. Something that would still be there when all of this was dust. By June, Takeshi's unit had been reduced to less than half its original strength. The Americans had taken most of the southern ridges. They were closing in. Artillery fell every day, sometimes every hour. Shells that made the earth leap and heaved boulders through the air like leaves. Men were buried alive in collapsed tunnels. Others were simply erased, turned to mist and memory by direct hits. The ones who survived envied the ones who did not. An officer, a lieutenant whose name Takeshi never learned, gave the order. They were to hold for 3 more days. 3 days. And then, if no reinforcements arrived, they were to conduct a final banzai charge at dawn on the fourth day. A human wave, bayonets fixed, no retreat, no survivors expected. It was not a plan, it was a ritual. A way to die with honor instead of starving in a cave. Takeshi understood. They all understood. The war was lost. Everyone knew it, even if no one said it aloud. The Americans were ashore in Okinawa. The fleet was destroyed. The cities were burning. There would be no divine wind, no miracle, just an ending, brutal and absolute. But the ending could still be faced with dignity. That was the only choice left. How you died. Not if. On the night before the charge, Takeshi could not sleep. He lay in the cave, listening to the breathing of the men around him. Some wept quietly. Some prayed. Some sat in silence, sharpening their bayonets over and over, the scrape of metal on stone a kind of meditation. Takeshi thought of his family, wondered if they were still alive. Hiroshima was far from the fighting, but the bombers went everywhere now. Perhaps his village had been spared. Perhaps not. He would never know. He took out a pencil and a piece of paper. He did not know why. There was no postal service in hell, no way to send a letter from a cave on a dying island, but his hands needed something to do, and his heart needed to say the things it had carried for too long. He began to write. The letter was not long, less than 2 pages, but every word was chosen with the care of a man who knows this is his last chance to speak, not to explain himself, not to justify the war or the cause or the years of blood. Just to speak, human to human, son to mother, brother to siblings, man to the people he loved and would never see again. He wrote in the formal style he had been taught as a boy, the careful characters that showed respect. But beneath the formality, the emotion bled through, raw and unfiltered, and achingly honest. He began simply, "To my honored mother and father, to Kenji and Yuki, I hope this letter finds you in good health, though I know it will not find you at all." He told them he was sorry, sorry for the worry he had caused, sorry that he would not be coming home to help with the harvest, to take care of them in their old age, to light incense at the family altar, sorry that he had failed in his duty as the eldest son. That single obligation, drilled into him since childhood, weighed heavier than any military order. The family depended on him, and he was about to abandon them. But then the formality cracked, the mask slipped, and the words became something more. "I do not know if I believed in this war," he wrote. "I do not know if I ever understood why we were fighting or what we were supposed to win. They told us it was for the emperor, for the nation, for honor. But here, in this cave, with the world ending around me, those words feel empty. I think maybe we were fighting because no one knew how to stop." He described the island, the beauty of it in those few moments when the guns were silent, the way the ocean looked at sunset, purple and gold, the birds that somehow still sang even with the smell of death everywhere. He wanted them to know that he had seen beauty, even here, even now, that the world was not only horror. He wrote about the other soldiers, boys, really, farm boys like himself, city boys who had never held a rifle until the army gave them one, students who had been pulled from their classrooms and told they were now warriors. They told jokes that were not funny. They shared cigarettes even though tobacco made them dizzy with hunger. They talked about food constantly, obsessively, describing meals they had eaten years ago in excruciating detail. It was a way to stay sane, or maybe a way to go insane slowly, on their own terms. "I have made friends here," he wrote, "good men, men I would have been proud to know in peacetime. We do not talk about tomorrow. We only talk about yesterday. It is safer that way." He told Kenji to take care of their parents, to be strong, to work hard in school if the school still existed, to remember that life goes on even when it does not feel like it should. He told Yuki not to cry for him too much, that he was not afraid. That was a lie, but a kind one. She was 9. She deserved to believe her brother had been brave. And to his mother, he wrote the thing that had been sitting in his chest for 2 years, the thing he had never been able to say in the letters that passed through military censors. "I am so tired, Mother. tired in a way that sleep cannot fix, tired of being afraid, tired of pretending I am not afraid. I want to come home. I want to sit in the kitchen and eat your cooking and listen to father complain about the weather. I want to hear Yuki laugh. I want to watch Kenji grow into a man. I want all the small, ordinary things I never appreciated when I had them. He paused there. The pencil hovered over the paper. Outside the cave, artillery rumbled, distant thunder. He had perhaps an hour before dawn. Perhaps less. He continued, I do not know if there is anything after this. The priests talked about reincarnation, about honor, about meeting the ancestors. I want to believe that. But I think maybe there is just darkness, and that is all right too. I am ready for the darkness. I am ready to rest. And then, at the end, almost as an afterthought, he added something that would break the heart of anyone who ever read it. If you remember me before the uniform. Remember, me the way I was, not the way they made me. Remember the boy who chased you through the rice fields, Yuki. Remember the son who helped you plant in the spring, father. Remember the brother who taught you to catch frogs, Kenji. Remember the child who was afraid of ghosts and loved sweet red bean cakes, mother. That is who I was. That is who I still am, underneath everything else. He signed his name, folded the letter carefully, slipped it into the ammunition canister along with a photograph of his family taken years before the war. He sealed the canister with wax from a candle and buried it in a crevice in the cave wall, wedged between stones where it might survive even if the cave collapsed. He did not write what he must have been thinking. That he was 23 years old, that he had never been in love, never fathered children, never done most of the things that make a life worth living. He did not need to write those things. They were in every line, in every word, in the silence between the words. As the sky began to lighten, he joined the others outside the cave. 43 men, bayonets fixed. The lieutenant said a prayer, something about the emperor and eternal glory. Takeshi did not listen. He closed his eyes and thought of home, the smell of his mother's kitchen, the sound of rain on the roof, his sister's laugh, and then the sun rose, and they charged. The American soldiers who held the valley never forgot that morning. Some of them were interviewed decades later, old men by then, and they still remembered. The sound first, a roar, not quite human, not quite animal, a sound of desperation and rage and resignation all mixed together. And then the figures appearing through the smoke, running down the slope, bayonets gleaming. The Americans fired, how could they not? It was war. You fired or you died. The machine guns opened up, the Japanese fell in waves, some kept running even after being hit, momentum and adrenaline carrying them forward until their bodies remembered they were already dead. A few made it close enough to engage, hand to hand, brutal, brief. It was over in less than 10 minutes. 43 men charged, 43 men died. None surrendered. Surrender was not an option, had never been an option. The Americans searched the bodies, looking for intelligence, maps, documents. They found letters, most of them. Personal effects were catalogued and, where possible, returned to families after the war. But some letters were lost. Some bodies were never identified. Some men simply vanished into the chaos and the mud and the mass graves, nameless and forgotten. Takeshi's body was not among those identified. There was no name tag, no identification. Just another dead soldier in a war that produced them by the millions. He was buried somewhere on Okinawa, in a grave marked only with a number. Or perhaps he was not buried at all. Perhaps he was lost entirely, bone and dust and memory. The cave where his letter lay, hidden, was sealed by artillery fire 2 days later. A shell collapsed the entrance. The ridge changed hands 3 more times before the Americans finally secured it in late June. By then, the landscape had been so thoroughly pulverized that no one could have said where one position ended and another began. The earth itself had been rewritten. The Battle of Okinawa officially ended on June 22nd, though pockets of resistance held out for weeks longer. More than 100,000 Japanese soldiers died, 12,000 Americans, and somewhere between 40,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians, caught between the armies, used as shields, killed by both sides, starved in caves, forced to commit suicide by Japanese officers who told them the Americans would do worse. The true number will never be known. Some simply disappeared, erased from history as thoroughly as they were erased from life. Japan surrendered in August after the atomic bombs. Hiroshima on the 6th, Nagasaki on the 9th. Emperor Hirohito announced the surrender on the 15th, his voice crackling over the radio, the first time most Japanese had ever heard him speak. He did not use the word surrender. He said the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. A masterpiece of understatement. A nation broken and burning, and he spoke of unfortunate developments. In a small village in Hiroshima Prefecture, a family listened to that broadcast, or rather, 3/4 of a family. The father, the mother, the brother, the sister. They had survived the bomb by a geographic accident. Their village was just far enough from the city center. Close enough to see the flash, close enough to feel the heat, but far enough to live. They waited for Takeshi to come home. The war was over. The soldiers were returning, the ones who had survived, thin men in ragged uniforms, limping down country roads, staring at nothing. Every day for weeks, the mother stood by the gate, watching the road, waiting. But he did not come. Official notification arrived in October. Missing, presumed dead. Died in service to the nation. Grateful for his sacrifice. A form letter, not even his name handwritten, just filled in a blank. The mother kept the letter in a box with the photograph and the other small things that had been his. A wooden top he had played with as a child, a school prize for calligraphy, a lock of hair from his first visit to the barber. She kept them for the rest of her life, 37 more years. She never stopped waiting, never stopped looking at the road when she heard footsteps. Some part of her never accepted that he was gone, that he had been gone for decades, that he was never coming home. The world moved on. It always does. Wars end, and economies rebuild, and children grow up, and the people who remember slowly fade away. Okinawa became a strategic base for the American military. The scars of battle were bulldozed and paved over. Jungles grew back. The ridges where men died became hiking trails. The beaches where the invasion began became resorts. Time is the most efficient eraser of history. Give it long enough, and even the worst horrors become just stories. Just dates in textbooks. Just monuments that people visit once and then forget. Takeshi's mother died in 1982. His father followed a year later. Kenji, the younger brother, became a teacher, married, raised children of his own. He told them about their uncle, the one who died before they were born. He kept the box of mementos and passed it to his own son, who kept it out of respect, but did not quite understand. How could he? Born in 1960, raised in peace, in prosperity, in a Japan that had rebuilt itself into an economic power. The war was ancient history. Sad, certainly, tragic, but not real in the way it had been real to his grandfather, to his father. Just stories. Yuki, the sister, never married. She became a nurse, spent 40 years caring for the elderly, for the sick, for the dying. She never spoke about why she chose that work, but those who knew her understood. Some wounds are passed down, some losses shape a life from a distance. She died in 2008, 83 years old, and the last thing she said to her niece was a name. Takeshi. She was 9 years old again, waving goodbye to a brother who would never come home. And in all those years, no one knew about the letter. It lay in the collapsed cave, sealed in the darkness, waiting. Waiting through decades of rain and sun and the slow, patient work of erosion. The island forgot it. History forgot it. Everyone who might have looked for it was gone. Until the summer of 2020, the construction crew that found it was not expecting anything. The site had been surveyed, the area had been cleared decades ago. All the known caves had been explored, documented, sealed, or left open as historical sites. This was just dirt, just land. But war has a way of hiding things deeper than surveys can see. When the bulldozer uncovered the opening, they called in an archaeological team as required by law. Okinawa is full of undiscovered sites, unmarked graves, unexploded ordnance. You do not take chances. The archaeologists arrived, set up a perimeter, began the careful work of excavation. They found the cave system within a week. Partially collapsed, as expected, human remains. Bones and scraps of uniform and rusted equipment. Soldiers, clearly, but identification would require forensic analysis. They catalogued everything, numbered every bone, every button, every fragment. This was a tomb, and it deserved respect. One of the archaeologists, a young woman named Akiko, found the ammunition canister wedged in a crevice near what had once been the cave entrance. It was corroded, barely recognizable. She almost left it. Ammunition canisters were common, usually empty, usually nothing. But something made her look closer. A weight, a sense that this one was different. She brought it to the surface, carefully pried it open in the laboratory, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived, was the letter. The paper was fragile, brown with age. The ink faded to the point of barely being legible. But it was readable. Just barely. She called in specialists, conservators who worked with old documents, historians who could provide context, linguists who could parse the formal Japanese of 75 years ago. And slowly, word by word, they reconstructed Takeshi Yamamoto's final message to his family. Akiko read it alone first, in her office after everyone had gone home. She was 31 years old. She had read hundreds of wartime documents, diaries, letters, reports. She thought she had become immune to them. But this one broke her. She sat at her desk and cried for a man she had never met, a man who had been dead longer than she had been alive. She cried for the boy who wanted to go home, for the mother who waited by the gate, for the family that never knew he had thought of them in his final hours, for the sheer, unbearable waste of it all. All those deaths, all that suffering. For what? For nothing. For maps that no longer exist, and empires that crumbled, and causes that everyone forgot. The letter was published in the local newspaper first, then picked up by the national media, then international. The photograph of Takeshi, young and serious, appeared in papers around the world. His words were translated into dozens of languages. For a brief moment he was famous. Not as a soldier, not as a warrior, as a human being who had loved and feared and hoped and died. The letter was eventually donated to the Okinawa Prefectural Peace Memorial Museum, where it is displayed in a climate-controlled case. Thousands of people visit every year. They stand in front of the glass and read the translation printed beside it, and many of them cry. Not just Japanese visitors. Americans too, Australians, Europeans. People from countries that did not even exist in 1945, because pain is universal, loss is universal. The knowledge that war destroys the things we love most, that is universal too. But there is more to the story. There is always more. Kenji's son, the one who inherited the box of mementos, saw the news story, recognized his uncle's name, recognized the photograph. He was 60 years old by then, a retired engineer. He had not thought about his uncle in years, had not looked at the box in decades. But now he opened it, took out the photograph, and realized it was the same one. The same picture that had been in the ammunition canister. His grandmother must have had duplicates, one for her son to carry to war. He traveled to Okinawa, met with Akiko and the museum staff, brought the box of mementos, stood in front of the display case and looked at his uncle's words for the first time, read the letter that had been written to his father, to his aunt, to grandparents he barely remembered. He told Akiko that his father had spoken of Takeshi often, called him the lost one, the one who never came home, said that his father never quite recovered from it, that some part of him had stopped at age 12, waiting for a brother who would never arrive, that he had named his own son Takeshi, hoping maybe the name could be lived again, could be happy this time. He was just a kid, Kenji's son said, looking at the photograph. My uncle. 23. That's nothing. That's just the beginning of a life. Akiko nodded. She had thought the same thing, thought it every time she read the letter. This was not a hero's story. This was not glorious. This was just sad. Just a waste. Just a young man who wanted to live and was not allowed to. They stood there for a long time, the nephew and the archaeologist, looking at the words of a man who had been silenced by history and had waited 75 years to speak. What does a story like this teach us? What are we supposed to take from it? There are no easy lessons here, no redemptive arc. Takeshi Yamamoto did not die for a noble cause. He did not die protecting anyone. He died because he was ordered to, because surrender was not permitted, because the machinery of war had caught him and chewed him up and spit him out like it did to millions of others. His death changed nothing. The war would have ended the same way, with or without him. He was, in the most literal sense, expendable. But his words were not. His words endured when his body did not. His love endured, his fear, his hope, his humanity. That is what survived the war, not the ideology, not the glory, not the empire. Just the voice of a young man saying, "I want to go home. I want to see my mother. I want to live." We tell ourselves stories about war. We call it necessary. We talk about sacrifice and honor and duty. And sometimes war is necessary. Sometimes there is no choice. But we must never ever forget what it costs. Not just in abstract numbers, not just in casualty lists and percentages, but in individuals. In young men like Takeshi who loved their families and missed home and were terrified and wrote letters they knew would never be read. Every name on every monument was a person, had a mother, had dreams, had a future that was stolen from them. We owe them the truth that war is not grand, not beautiful, not glorious. It is horror and waste and the destruction of potential. It is boys dying in caves, writing letters to mothers who will never read them. And yet, there is something in this story that is not only sadness. There is the fact that the letter was found, that after 75 years of silence, Takeshi spoke again, that his family learned what happened to him, that his words reached across the decades and touched people he never knew, in countries he never visited, in a world he could not have imagined. There is the fact that we still care, that we still listen, that a construction crew stopped work to excavate a cave, that archaeologists spent months carefully reconstructing a letter that had no tactical value, no historical importance, except the importance of being human, that millions of people around the world read his words and felt something, felt the connection across time and culture and language, felt the grief of a mother waiting by a gate, felt the fear of a boy in a cave, felt the universal truth that we are all in the end just trying to get home. That is what endures. Not the empires, not the ideologies. The empires crumble, the ideologies fade. But the human heart, the need to love and be loved, to be remembered, to matter, that remains. That is what connects us to Takeshi Yamamoto. Not the war, not the politics. Just the shared experience of being human in a world that is often cruel and always temporary. The museum in Okinawa has a wall where visitors can leave messages. Thoughts, reflections, prayers. Thousands of notes have accumulated there over the years. Many of them reference Takeshi. Thank you for sharing your story. I'm sorry for what happened to you. I hope you're at peace. Children leave drawings. Flowers appear, left by hands unknown. One message, written in English by an American veteran of Iraq, stands out. I don't know if we were on the same side or opposite sides. I don't know if it matters. You were a soldier. So was I. You were afraid. So was I. You wanted to go home. So did I. I made it. You didn't. I'm sorry. I wish you had made it too. That is perhaps the closest thing to wisdom that war can teach. We are not that different. Japanese, American, German, Russian, soldier, civilian, enemy, friend. Beneath the uniforms and the flags and the rhetoric, we are the same. We want the same things: safety, love, home. And war takes those things from us, indiscriminately, brutally, and without mercy. Takeshi's letter is a reminder, a voice from the past, speaking to the present, warning the future. Listen, it says, this is what war costs. Not territory, not resources, not strategic advantage. It costs people. It costs futures. It costs mothers waiting by gates, and children growing up without fathers, and young men dying in caves, whispering goodbyes to families who will never hear them. We must remember, not to glorify, not to justify, but to bear witness, to say that these lives mattered, that these deaths were not just statistics, that every single one was a universe unto itself, full of love and fear and hope and potential, And that universe was destroyed for reasons that made sense to someone, somewhere, but probably do not make sense to us now, looking back across the years with the clarity that only hindsight provides. Takeshi Yamamoto was 23 years old. He liked sweet red bean cakes. He was afraid of ghosts. He loved his mother and his father and his brother and his sister. He died on a ridge in Okinawa on a morning in June of 1945, and 75 years later he spoke, and we listened. And in listening, we keep him alive in the only way that matters now, in memory, in the simple act of saying his name and acknowledging that he existed, that he mattered, that he was here. That is all any of us can hope for in the end, to be remembered, to have mattered, to have loved and been loved in return. Takeshi achieved that, not in the way he wanted, not in the way he deserved, but he achieved it nonetheless. And perhaps that is enough. Not justice, not fairness, but enough. A voice in the darkness saying I was here. I lived, I loved. Remember me. We remember. If stories like this move you, if they remind you of the weight of history and the cost of war and the enduring power of the human heart to speak across time, then subscribe to Battle Echoes. This is what we do. We find the forgotten voices, the lost letters, the names behind the numbers. We tell the stories that deserve to be told, not because they are triumphant, but because they are true. Because every voice matters. Because memory is the only immortality we have. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us as we listen to the echoes of a war that ended 8 decades ago, but still has so much to teach us if we are willing to listen. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for bearing witness to the life of Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto, who wanted to go home and never made it, but whose words finally found their way there, 7.5 decades late, carried by strangers who cared enough to listen. His letter is still waiting in a museum in Okinawa for you to read. And when you do, remember, he was not just a soldier, he was a son, a brother, a boy who chased fireflies and loved his mother and died too young. Remember him. That is all he asked. Remember me the way I was. We do, Takeshi. We do.